Hi everyone, we'll be waiting 2 to 3 minutes before starting the webinar to accommodate for the rest of the attendees who are in the middle of connecting. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us and thanks for being part of our community. My name is Valen Kolika and I'll be your host for today. Just a few reminders before we start. If you have issues viewing the stream at any time during the presentation and are using the web browser version of Teams, please refresh your browser. If you're using the desktop app of Teams, please exit and rejoin. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at aka.ms/security-webinars. Closed captions in several languages are available during the live broadcast, and you can enable them by clicking on the CC button located at the lower right corner of your screen. Now, feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window by clicking on the Ask Question button. Be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your question anonymously by just simply checking the box right below where you entered it. We often get many questions on these webinars, and we will do our best to respond to all of them in real time. In the event if the answer was not provided, or if you may have additional questions post this event, please don't hesitate to raise them on our Azure Security Center forum at aka.ms/ASC community. If you're listening to this after the fact as a recording, that's also a great place to ask a question. We love to hear your feedback on how we can improve on these webinars, and you can do so at aka.ms/security-webinar-feedback. I would also like to invite you to join our public community by visiting aka.ms/security-community. That's the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews, request features, give feedback, review our product roadmaps, register for events, or join webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is by removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. In today's session, Michael Maklevich will guide us through Azure Defender for SQL Anywhere. Mike Michael is a program manager with our Azure Security Center team, and without further ado, I will turn it over to him. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Valon. All right, so we're going to go today through Azure Defender for SQL Anywhere. And I know, at least for myself, there is all this Teams fatigue. We're sitting a lot against our screens. So the agenda is like that. We're going to start with the juicy part. We'll start with the SQL Server threats and SQL Server attacks. We're going to talk about some real campaigns, some real attack patterns, some things that we actually caught in the past few months. By the first part, I hope you will be convinced that if you haven't been protecting your SQL Server so far, you need to start almost immediately. And I say almost immediately because I don't want you to leave in the middle of my webinar. But if you're not protecting your SQL servers, please do so. At the second part, I'll present to you all the details of Azure Defender for SQL. And I hope you will think, as this is a good solution to protect your SQL servers. I know I'm biased, but I actually think it is a good solution. And then we'll give some broader context about where Azure Defender for SQL sits, because it's part of a greater picture, bigger perspective, which is Azure Defender and the whole Azure Security Center. And we'll just sum up. So as I said, we want to start with the juicy details, and I'm taking you back to April this year, the Vulgar campaign. The Vulgar campaign was a campaign that started with SQL, but it's pretty interesting because SQL wasn't the target of the attack. It was just a tool in the way to create a crypto mining network. What actually happened is that the attackers were spreading and trying to brute force SQL servers that has open ports to the internet. And when they were able to breach the SQL servers, they used the XP command shell, a command that allows you to run shell scripts from your SQL server on the OS layer to run a crypto mining network. And the volume of this attack was huge, and it was a global attack. So I checked a little bit where you all coming from, and you can see that this attack was reported everywhere. It was caught by Guardicore and reported by Guardicore, but we can see reports about it in French, in German, and in many other languages. It infected globally and infected tens of thousands of SQL servers around the world, creating really, really strong SQL server network. And I think when we're starting to talk about defending solutions, the first thing we want to understand is the motivation of the attackers to defend properly. So actually, we have two main motivations. And here we are looking at a generic scheme of some application. It's a web application going through an application gateway to some SQLs. This person is going through what we probably all going through, which is a migration to the cloud. So he has some SQLs in the cloud. Some are native Azure SQLs. Some are SQL servers on virtual machines in Azure. Some of his machines he decided to keep at his basement, so he added them the Arc agent and connected them to Azure. And for some, he doesn't got to solve them yet, so he just have those on-premise machines in his basement, not connecting to anything but to his environment. And now we want to see why would the attacker try to approach the SQL servers. So the first thing is the things that we think about the most is the data. Right? When we're talking about SQL defense, the first thing that comes to mind is protecting the data that is in the SQL. Data is the crown jewel of modern time, and we meet the need to defend data practically everywhere. We hear almost on a monthly basis about a big data breach in the news. I myself concerned sometimes that my, I know now it's been Black Friday a few days ago, and I paid with my credit cards to some websites. I am concerned on a daily basis that my payment data will leak. So this is the kind of the obvious thing, and it's the thing that we also meet in all GDPR regulations, HIPAA. We all know we need to protect our data. The second thing, and that's the thing that a lot of time people miss, is the compute that the SQL is running upon. So apparently, SQL has a lot of powers above the compute. And as we said, it can communicate with the internet, communicate with a lot of other machines. Sometimes it has some central structure meaning that you have many machines that communicate into the same SQL server, so it's a great place for lateral movement. And what we see a lot is that attackers try to breach SQL server, all SQL servers also, trying to breach them with brute force. And after they succeed, they're using the SQL server ability to run shell scripts to install something on the machine. It can be a crypto miner, it can be a ransomware, it can be any other tool, and through the SQL server get into the compute and then spreading in the network or using that compute. This is the attack that a lot of people doesn't take to mind, which was exactly experienced in the Vulgar campaign. The attacker brute forced the SQL Server machine, used the XP command shell, went to the OS layer and installed the crypto miner. And what are the common threats on SQL Server? How attackers attack the SQL Server? So you have a few ways. You can try to do it through the application using SQL injection. This is a great way for the first motivation we talked about, stealing the data. You can also insert some pieces of code, but this is usually a bit harder. Another thing to do is try to brute force. If you have a direct access to the SQL Server, if it's open to the internet, or if you are, if the attacker was able to get into the internal network and then is trying to touch the SQL, so you can try to brute force it. And the last thing that we a lot of times don't think about is that, and it's going to come a lot in this webinar, is that a lot of the attacks are kind of a hybrid in the resources they include. So this webinar is talking about Azure Defender for SQL, but we're not going to talk only about SQL, because a lot of SQL attacks can start in a breached machine or a breached identity. So luckily, what we're going to see soon in our demo, because we want the demo we want to have a hands-on experience in this webinar. So luckily, we will see that we have protection and alerting about most of those things. We have SQL injection attack detection, we have brute force attack granular detection, and I'll touch that. We have a threat intelligence-based detection. So if your machine was communicating with some CNC server somewhere else, and then the same machine is trying to access your SQL, we will alert you about that. And we also have login anomaly detection. So if you have a valid identity, but this identity was breached, and now you see it's behave in an anomalous way or in a weird way, and trying to access SQL Server it haven't accessed before, or trying to access SQL Server from location it haven't accessed before, we will also alert you about that. But this is the part of the attack is already going on, and now we're trying to catch it. We're also helping you to avoid those attacks, or try to mitigate those attacks a priori as much as possible with the all vulnerability assessment part. So we suggest you to disable the XP command shell, the exact command that we talked about that allow you to run a shell from your SQL Server, which makes the damage that you can create with the breached SQL Server in magnitude larger. We suggest you to disable the SA login, which is a well-known login to everyone. This is the default login, so attackers really love using it when they're trying to brute force, and it's actually working for them. And we have also, as I mentioned, detections in other layers. So if you'll use, for example, Azure Defender for machines, which is a part of our bigger family, Azure Defender, so you can also have information about crypto mining activity already running on the machine. So you might know the machine is already breached, and the attacker can come from the machine to the SQL Server for lateral movement experience. So as promised, now we'll get to the demo. And in the demo, you will see pretty much an attack that is pretty much similar to the Vulgar campaign, and how you could catch this with easily enabling and then seeing this attack with Azure Defender for SQL. So I have here prepared our price and settings page, and turning on Azure Defender for SQL is really an easy thing. All you need to do is just click on. I can't save because I already had it on, of course, but that's what you do, and then you protect all your resources. So of course, this turns on your entire Azure Defender. You'll protect also servers, storage, lots of things, but you will also protect what we're talking about today, Azure SQL database servers and SQL servers on machines that are outside of Azure. When you turn on and save the Azure Defender, you will have this portal enabled for you. In this portal, you can see your defense status across multiple resources. And again, all those resources, you know it better than I do, are connected, right? You can, if you protect your SQL server, but back up all your data into a storage account, and then the storage account gets breached, your data is exposed. So you need to protect your entire solution, entire environment, and not only resource by resource. SQL Server is an inherent and important resource, and attackers love to attack it. We'll see it a bit later, but it's important to protect your entire environment. So now we're going to zoom in on a specific machine. Here we have a demo machine that we created, and it's important to see that this machine is originally outside of Azure, right? It's a SQL Server 2016, even an Express edition. It sits somewhere here in our offices, and we connected it through Azure Arc to Azure. So you can see in your portal a native experience. You just see this machine as it was born in Azure. It wasn't. It was installed here a few months ago, and then we just connected it to Azure, and now we can manage and control it from Azure. And another thing we can do is to have security coverage for this machine. So I'll go here for security, and we see that we have two parts. We have two parts for Azure Defender for SQL. We have the recommendations part, the vulnerability assessment, the thing that help you to harden your machine, and we have the security incidents and alerts. This is the part where catching attacks that are trying to get to your machine. So this is kind of like a vicious cycle, right? You try to harden as much as possible, then attackers get sophisticated, you see more attacks, and you try to harden a little bit more. So here we'll go to the vulnerability assessment part of SQL. And we can see here scanning of your entire environment. Excuse me, here we're seeing a scanning of a machine. You can see the status of every database, how many checks were valid, not valid, passed through. And you can see here specifically for our story and the story that we're telling, two very interesting recommendations. The first one is saying SA login should be disabled, and the second one is saying XP command shell should be disabled. So without SA and without XP command shell, most of the attackers, it will be much harder to brute force your machine because they will need to brute force both the password and the username. And without XP command shell, even if they do brute force your machine, they couldn't do as much damage as they could with XP command shell. So let's see what we can see at the SA login should be disabled. By clicking on it, you can see here the recommendation. You have a description that explains you why it's important, how to remediate it. You even have a query to remediate it. You see benchmarks that it's related to, the impact that can be caused if you don't remediate it, and etc. Going back to our machine, you also have alerts. So one of the alerts that we see here is potential SQL brute force attempt. We all can guess, and this is also a demo that we created, that this have something to do with the SA login is open. And by clicking on it, we'll get to the alert experience. And of course, we see that the client principal name that the attacker was trying to brute force was the SA name, and there were 100 failed logins. You see here all the attack details, but also more importantly, or in the same value importantly, is that you see here information about the affected resource, right? Because Azure Defender for SQL is living in your native environment in Azure, and it's giving you the entire context, not only the security part, but also your working context. So you can see here all your Azure tags. You see here that the environment is production. You can see to which subscription this SQL server belongs. It makes it much easier to mitigate the attack. You can go to take action and see our suggestions. So you see here how to mitigate threats. You need to block the IP addresses and tight your firewall as much as possible, block the SA, and you have a link back to your SQL server. But as we discussed before, now we looked at an attack on the SQL server, but now we already know that sometimes SQL server is not the whole story, right? Attackers try to start with the SQL server, but then they go forward from the SQL server to your entire network. So Azure Defender for SQL, as all Azure Defender solutions, is integrated natively with Azure Sentinel, and we can see the entire attack there. I'm going here to an Azure Sentinel workspace I have, and I see here that I have 3 alerts. Potential SQL brute force, the alert that we just checked, and also suspicious SVC host process executed and suspicious process executed. Things that are connected to crypto miner, like in the Vulgar campaign. So I click on investigate, and here I have a graph solution. In the graph solution, I can see that I had a potential SQL brute force using SA on a machine, and on that same machine, suspicious SV host and suspicious process was running. And click on the timeline, I can see that those happened one after the another. So actually, what happened here is exactly what happened in the Vulgar campaign, and we saw it through. We enabled Azure Defender for SQL and the entire Azure Defender experience very easily. Then we were able to harden our environment, block the SA account, block the XP command shell from running. We didn't do that to actually demonstrate the attack. And then the attack used brute force, and through the brute force ran using XP command shell, a payload on the machine, and connected this machine to a crypto miner network. So go back to our demo. Right. So far I was talking about and presenting these possible attacks, but does those attacks actually happen? So the answer is yes, and I'm going to show you a real attack that we caught 2 months ago for a customer and helped him to mitigate it. And I think it's important to say that like all the things I showed are not theoretical, right? They're actually attacks that happen every day. Actually, even today we caught an attack of this type, an attacker brute forcing the machine. The SA was in use with a weak password. The XP command shell was enabled. The attacker is putting malware on the machine, and now he actually controls the entire compute the SQL Server is running upon. So we caught one today. We caught dozens of those attacks in our public preview going through the past few months. And here is an explicitly interesting attack. So here we have one example. Those are print screens from the research of one of our genius data scientists, Andre. So what we see here, we see here a lot of probing attempts on a machine of the customer. And all of those are brute forces on the SQL Server. So we see that the customer is getting a lot of alerts about his SQL Server. He's trying to be brute forced basically on a daily basis. We see another alert, another alert, another alert, and the customer doing nothing. Suddenly the customer was brute forced. The attacker was patient enough and was able to break his password. And then we see ransomware running on this customer. The customer is getting his whole environment encrypted and is a bit panicked, but he has a backup. So he recovers using a backup, and he thinks that his backup is clean. But then we see that the ransomware is happening again. The customer is again recovering from the backup, and the ransomware is happening again. So what's going on here? Apparently, the attacker also created a persistent malicious user in the SQL Server, and the backup was already polluted. So what actually happening is that every time the user is doing a backup, the attacker already have his own malicious user with the password that he set himself. And this is a common pattern we see also in the Vulgar campaign. We see in most of the campaigns. And the attacker is able to run his ransomware again and again and again. At somewhere at this point, we touch contact with the user, and we're talking with him about what's happening. So the user saw the brute forces on his SQL Server, and he knew that he received the ransomware, but he didn't knew to connect them both. He wasn't aware of this option. This is why we started with this motivation. He tried to protect his data in the SQL, but he didn't realize the SQL might be the access point to the attack on his entire network. So actually, what happened here is that we talked with the customer. He recovered from the backup. He deleted the malicious user that was created. And since then, we haven't saw any ransomware happening on his environment. You can see here that he's still having a SQL brute force attacks, but we talked with the customer, and the customer said that his SQL server needs to be open to the internet until they'll change this setup. But they added two verification steps and a stronger password. And this attack, it's not I know, a unicorn or something special. We see a lot of them. So here you have a sneak peek to the past 2 months of our honeypot network, monitoring some attacks for our research. I couldn't share the scales, but believe me, this is not saying 6 or even 100 here. We're seeing big volumes, and the trend is not declining. Right, we keep seeing a lot of those attacks. Again, there is a lot to gain for attackers. So I hope that by this point you are all convinced that protecting your SQL server is very important, because the motivation for attackers to attack your SQL server is really, really high. Both the information sitting in the SQL server and the abilities to do a lateral movement to put a persistent base in your SQL server is really, really high, which gives a lot of motivation to attackers and makes them attack SQL Server. So what Azure Defender for SQL can suggest you. So Azure Defender for SQL is built out of 2 parts, as you saw in the short demo. We have advanced threat protection, which finds attacks and alerting about them. And we have vulnerability assessment, which help you to harden the environment. If we'll go through the value proposition of each. So advanced threat protection helps you with few main pillars of attacks. We have a patented SQL injection attack detection, which is a really smart SQL injection detection, which can catch both actual SQL injections and vulnerabilities to SQL injection when something weird is happening. I can't elaborate too much, but it's not a really basic rule-based looking for ampersand or 1 equal 1 thing. We're actually looking at building some state and understanding of how your SQL queries behave, and when we see that someone is trying to breach them or manipulate them, we alert you. We have a brute force attack detection, and previously I mentioned this is a granular brute force attack detection. After we saw that brute force attacks are a really, really popular actually door into your network, we decided to emphasize on those detection, and we just split it into a few flavors of brute force. And now we know to alert you about general brute force attack on a valid login. So this means that the attacker already knows that you are using this login and trying to breach something that if you will have enough time or enough attempts, probably will be able to breach. And successful brute force, which is a really, really red flag. And if you get this one, you know that you need to back up your environment, look for persistent user, look what your SQL Server shell commands ran, stuff like that. Beside that, by connecting to Azure Defender for SQL, you also receive a package of threat intelligence-based detections. So we buy and we also create a lot of threat intelligence signals. We see machines that connect to malicious controlling servers, machines that are trying to do brute force on other machines, and then we record all of that and give you information about it. And these alerts are also, in particular, very, very important because they can catch things that are not weird on the SQL level, but they're weird and malicious on one layer beneath. So, for example, if your machine was breached and you don't know it, maybe you connecting to your SQL server in a really valid way to do your work. I connect to my SQL server every day, but I don't know my machine is breached. So I don't know this connection puts the SQL server into danger, and I wouldn't see it. But if the machine is breached and communicated to some server, so we'll be able to alert on that. And it's important to say that all of our alerts, as all of Azure Defender alerts, are natively compatible with Azure Sentinel. So all of them have the same entities, and you can do cross-connection, research the graph, as we saw in the demo. The second part that is trying to help you avoid all of this And although this is the product I own, I wish you not to encounter any of those detections, because it means you're under attack. And the thing that will help you to avoid those detections is vulnerability assessment. Vulnerability assessments help you to identify security misconfigurations, users that you left open, and stuff like that. It suggests you actionable remediation steps, so you don't need to wonder what you do when you get a recommendation. You have in most of them queries that you can actually run and just close the gap. You have security baseline to tune in the environment to your needs. So if your environment is special, or you have some condition that you want to the vulnerability assessment to address, you can add the security baseline. And of course, if you're already in the environment of Azure Security Center, so you're probably trying to lower your secure score, and vulnerability assessment is helping you to do that. It's a part of the secure score. It helps you track the health of your entire environment. An important thing to say is that Azure Defender for SQL protects your SQLs anywhere. Because if you protect only parts of your SQLs, as the example we gave with backup to storage, that's not interesting, right? And also for ease of use, you don't want to deploy one solution to SQL servers on-prem, another solution for Azure SQL servers. And if you happen to have a multi-cloud environment or hybrid environment, put another solution for your SQL servers in AWS or something like that. So Azure Defender for SQL protects your SQL anywhere. Your Azure SQL databases, your Azure SQL managed instance, the dedicated SQL pools in Azure Synapse Analytics, which is a really new offering. Azure Arc enabled SQL servers on Azure Virtual Machines, SQL servers on AWS, or actually on any other cloud and on your premise. For Azure SQL, all the native Azure SQL databases, managed instance, Synapse, this is a really easy experience. You just turn it on, as we saw in the video, and that's it. You're protected. You're protected for retroactively for all the SQL servers that you have in Azure, and you will be protected from now on. Every new SQL server will be discovered, and you'll be protected. For all the SQL servers raising on machines, in machines that are connected to Azure through Arc, or there are virtual machines in Azure, or also machines outside of Azure, you have Azure Security Center centralized management tools, you have auto provisioning, you have policy enablement, you have inventory, a lot of tools that help you to discover and make this also an almost just turn it on. It's kind of like just turn it on and add one configuration experience. So you don't need to discover, you don't need to look for your SQL servers across all your clouds. Azure Security Center is doing that for you. You give it a permission, and it's doing all the connections. To connect all the SQL servers that are not natively sitting in Azure, what you need to do is to have an OMS agent on them, which will connect them to Log Analytics Workspace. And on that Log Analytics Workspace, you need to have Azure Defender for SQL solution. But although it already sounds simple, Azure Security Center makes it even simpler for you. When you turn it on in Azure Security Center, it automatically adds the Azure Defender solution to your Log Analytics Workspace. And if you allow auto provisioning and also using the policy, you can make sure all your machines are connected to the relevant Log Analytics Workspace, and then you are all protected. But now let's zoom out a little bit. As we discussed, a lot of the attacks are coming from multiple layers. So it's important to say that if you already in Azure Defender protected using Azure Security Center or some of Azure Defender solutions, or you started with Azure Defender for SQL and you want to expand, this is really easy. And Azure Defender gives you a comprehensive set of solutions. Azure Defender for SQL, and here it is a little bit more elaborated. This is only part of Azure Defender. Azure Defender also helps you to protect your servers, your storage, Kubernetes, container, Key Vault, app services, and it's keep expanding. I took here the few main ones. And this is in particular important because, again, attackers have two motivations, and I keep coming to this point. One motivation is the data. So you need to protect all your SQL servers and your storage. Everywhere you have data, you need to protect it. A, because it builds trust with your customers. and B, because you will receive a huge fine from GDPR, HIPAA, PCA, or any other regulator if you will get your data breach. Fun fact, I see we're really fine with the time. Recently, I heard about ransomware attack in which the attacker told the company that was being attacked that if they won't pay him the blackmailing he was asking for, he will rent them to the GDPR regulator. So he told them, either you pay me, either I'll expose that you have a data breach and you'll need to pay lots of fines. And this is the situation, right? So data is really important. But another thing is that we see again, attacks are complicated. You can put the authentications for your SQL in the key vault. You can back up your data from the SQL to storage. Your SQL sits on a server or now can be sitting in a Kubernetes. You need to protect all of this, and Azure Defender helps you to do that. Zooming out even a little bit more. So Azure Defender is one of Microsoft Defender solutions. The other one is Microsoft 365 Defender. And they're both, again, natively connected to Azure Sentinel SIEM, to which you can also add multi-cloud solutions and third-party and partner security solutions. But this is really important because what we're trying to emphasize is that we want the SQL security, both the data and the ability to expand from the SQL to your entire network, be easy and native for you. And the SQL security solution that we're suggesting is behaving like any other security solution you probably already know from the Microsoft universe, or if you don't know any of them. So first of all, you should try them, they're great. But second of all, you can start with SQL and then really easily expand. It will look the same, it will connect the same, it will be managed the same. This is a really, really easy thing to do. And zooming out even a little bit more, Azure Defender for SQL is part of Azure Security Center. And Azure Security Center is suggesting you the all Azure Defender experiences with advanced protection, detection and response capabilities, and vulnerability assessment, but also suggest you to strengthen your multi-cloud security posture with secure score, policies and compliance, improved automation, and having all in one place. And now we're leveraging Azure Arc. You have this all in a native place. So I want to leave a lot of time for questions because I myself go to a lot of webinars this time when you can't meet people, you can't go to meetups. And I know this is really sometimes exhausting just to listen. So I try to keep this really short. But this is an important summary, and I think the picture at the right side summarizes pretty well together with the points. Why turning on Azure Defender for SQL is a really great return on investment. So the first thing is that you just turn it on, right? It's easy. You don't need to handle complicated deployments and stuff like that. Bring a team that will, or I don't know, send one of your engineer or one of your SOC analysts to have a course of a week about how to configure this Azure Defender for SQL thing without hurting the network. You just click on a button. It's, I know, this is the experience we're used to from this SaaS era. You just click and it works. If it's in the cloud, natively in the cloud, so it's actually only one click. If it's outside of the cloud, so you have 3 clicks, 2 clicks to connect those machines automatically using the management tools to the cloud, and the same click that you already did before to enable it. The second thing is this is coming built in and it's native in your Azure SQL experience, and you can see it here. We had a SQL server that is outside of Azure. But using Arc, we enabled it. We made it an Azure Arc enabled SQL Server. And now you have an experience for this SQL Server in the portal. In the portal, where your DBA can look at it, and the DevOps can look at it, and everybody that is working with the SQL can look at it. You already see the security recommendations and the security alerts. You don't need to send those people that are not aware of Azure Sentinel or other SIEM that you are using. You don't need to email them or convince them that they can go and check the security situation. The security situation is coming to them. You go to your resource and you just see the security situation of this resource, the alerts and the recommendation for that resource in the resource experience. So this is important. It spares you a lot of education on those subjects. The next thing is the two things that Azure Security Center are suggesting you, and Azure Defender for SQL suggesting you. The vulnerability assessment parts, which helps you with secure score and compliance, which make you ready before the attacks are coming, and detections on the main attacks, SQL injection, brute force, as we said, and unusual access detections. And the next thing is that if you want to expand, right? Because we touched this a lot. If you want to expand from the SQL universe to a bigger defending universe, right? So this is again a native experience. You can use the Azure Defender experience and Azure Security Center to protect a lot of different resources, and they're all and all the alerts can be investigated natively in Azure Sentinel, and it's the same experience for everything. You see everything in the portal. You see, you manage everything centralized through Azure Security Center. You investigate all together in Azure Sentinel. You don't need to learn new things every time. You start with one solution, or you add this solution, and you are in a part of a comprehensive family that helps you to secure your entire network, your SQL, the data in your SQL, and the entire environment of the SQL. So you can't go from the SQL to the network, or from the network to the SQL. And that's pretty much it. I think we have 15 minutes for questions, but I really encourage you to join us. Go to AKA MS, Azure Defender for SQL, and there you have elaborated, I say elaborated, but they're pretty short, instructions on how to enable Azure Defender for SQL and other Azure Defender solutions. And you can easily integrate it with Azure Sentinel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mickey. Great content. Let me share here my screen for the folks to raise some questions. Let me do that here quickly. Okay. So I posted the link. It's in the chat room, basically paulev.com/security-webinars. And the way this works, it's you submit your question to Mickey, and you can also upvote or downvote each other's questions. And let's see how that goes. We'll give it a few seconds here. Although the team has done a great job in the background answering lots of questions. So I wouldn't be surprised not to have much here, but we'll see.
I assume you don't have questions because you all went to enable Azure Defender for SQL?
Or maybe went on Cyber Monday to shop. After enabling Defender. Okay, looks like Chris has posted a question, and I'm going to break the ice for the folks. So I'll go ahead and copy and paste Chris's question here. Here we go.
Right, so the top one is we're using Sentinel, Azure Sentinel, and the VMs are using the Sentinel LAW. Can we use this existing log analytics workspace as part of Azure Defender? And if so, how, please? Oh, it's jumping. So sure, yes, you can use the same log analytics. If your VMs are already connected to some log analytics workspace, and those VMs are having SQLs on them, all you need to do is to go to this log analytics workspace and add a solution. How do you do that? You go to Azure Security Center. There you have a pricing and settings tab. And in this pricing and settings, you have subscriptions. But besides subscriptions, you also have specific log analytics workspaces. You click on that, and there you will see an option to add Azure Defender for SQL. It states SQL Server on machines on. It's one toggle, and that's it. What will happen is that after you click on the toggle, the security solution will be adjusted to your log analytics workspace, and all the virtual machines that connected to this log analytics workspace will adhere this solution and protect the SQL Server on them. I hope this answered your question. Mentioned monitoring and responding to a hybrid environment. Which other third-party cloud providers can be supported? Any cloud provider can be supported. If it's sitting on a Windows machine, currently we don't support Linux, but if it's sitting on a Windows machine, you can use the OMS workspace. Some clouds have a better experience, better experience using Azure Arc and other connectors. The reason I emphasize the AWS is because it's a really popular cloud. So there are really some, it shows you this, all of your machines in like orange, pretty color. But actually you can do it with any cloud. You connect their Azure Arc, you use the OMS agent, and you are good to go. Which attacks are near real time and which take upon 1 hour to detect? Is it based on the design and attack importance or based on other aspects? So most of our, it's a really interesting question. It's based on a few things. On the first layer, we can say that it's based on the design, but the design is coming from somewhere, right? So SQL injection is real time, and we're working on a few new alerts that are real time. The other alerts don't take 1 hour, but they might take up to half an hour, and those are the anomaly detections and the brute force. The anomaly detections take up to an hour because we're trying to spare you the compute, so we're doing the compute on our side. We don't take the sensitive data from the SQL Server, we take only the logins, but then we upload them to our cloud and do the compute on our compute power to be more efficient for you. And this takes a little bit of time, so it might take up to half an hour, 20 minutes. It depends on the region you are sitting in. The brute force is done in the same way, but now we're working on making it faster. I hope this answered your question. How can I predict Sentinel DB size from DB log? I'm not sure I understood this question. If I can have elaboration. Oh, I think if you mean how can you know how many logs will get to Sentinel because you enabled our solution. So we're not actually putting them on the workspace. We're just using the infrastructure of the workspace secure connection to upload the information to us, but you won't be billed for the logins. But if you're just interested in the IO bound that you might see on your machine, so we're taking only logins up to our side. So if your machine has an intensive amount of user logging into the SQL Server, there will be a lot of logs. If you have mainly queries running on the machine, but you are not doing login, log off a lot of times, so you won't see a lot of logs. But anyhow, we don't store the logs on your log analytics workspace.
Great, thanks, Mickey. Quick reminders before we end the call. For the upcoming webinars, please visit us at aka.ms/security webinars. We have a couple more weeks before the end of this year, and we have quite of a schedule out there. And then following, and then continuing next year, there's quite a bit of coming. And in case we missed to answer your question, or if you have additional questions, as mentioned before, when opening the call, you can visit us on our Azure Security Center forum at aka.ms/ASC community. I would like to close this webinar by thanking Mickey for an excellent presentation. Thank you to the rest of the team who helped answering the questions, and most of all, I want to thank all of you for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye.